Muy buenos días, muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes. El día de hoy estamos en una nueva transmisión para Proyecto Grado Cero. Nos encontramos en la Universidad Iberoamericana. Agradecemos mucho al Departamento de Filosofía que nos haya permitido también poder tener este pequeño espacio para poder tener una pequeña charla con el doctor Michael Naas de la Universidad de Paul en Chicago. Justamente acaba de hacer una pequeña charla, una pequeña presentación de dos textos que han sido muy importantes, el último seminario de Jacques Derrida, que estuviera realizando entre el periodo del 2001 a 2003, mismos que recientemente fueron traducidos al español y al inglés también no tiene mucho tiempo que fueron editados. En este sentido, podríamos hacer, sobre todo para los temas que hemos estado trabajando aquí en el proyecto, hay varias preguntas respecto a este primer seminario. Quizá una de las primeras preguntas tendría que ver con el debate que hace Jacques Derrida respecto a la constitución en Occidente de lo que es lo propio del hombre. ¿Qué hace la...
Yeah, what we would like you to comment on is how, or what's Derrida's approach towards anthropology in a way of what's properly human. You know, in this text, he's like, I think in all of his work, he's trying to really untangle what it means to be human, finally. Yes. So if you would like to maybe comment a little bit more on specifically that point regarding this seminars.
Sure, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation to participate with you. You know, the question of the animal was something that was important to Derrida from the very beginning in many ways. Already of grammatology, Derrida talks about the way in which the trace must be thought beyond the human. So it was never a discourse that was simply enclosed within a conception of human intention and human language. In fact, it was a discourse that fought against that and opened up a thinking of the human to a thinking of the non-human in the form of animal, plant, and other forms of levers of traces. But it is the case that starting in the mid to late 1990s, the question of the animal became even more explicit and is the center of a couple of very important texts, from The Animal That Therefore I Am in 1997 to these two volumes on The Beast and the Sovereign from 2001, 2002, and then 2002, 2003. And you notice that they're called The Beast and The Sovereign. The sovereign can't be reduced to the human. We're trying to think a series of qualities that are to be thought in relationship to sovereignty and the sovereign. But obviously the sovereign is the human. The human is the sovereign in almost all of the philosophical discourses that Derrida is reading, from Plato and Aristotle on. So what does Derrida do when he comes across this relationship, or this usually denigration of the animal by and in the name of the human, where the human says, for example, that only the human has logos, or only the human can mourn, or only the human has technology or tears, or only the human can lie. And Derrida, in the first volume of The Beast and the Sovereign, traces those very claims in various philosophers, from Plato and Aristotle up to Lacan. So what does he do? Well, first he questions whether or not that really is true, whether or not discourses of ethology or anthropology, but especially ethology, have not shown us, the very best works in those fields show us that the animal, some animals, again, Derrida's questioning the monolithic category, the animal. He's questioning whether some animals might not in fact have language, might not in fact mourn, might not in fact have a relationship to technology, and so on. So that's the first gesture that he always makes. And in that case, and with that gesture, I think he's very amenable to many other thinkers of animal ethics and animal rights. But his second gesture is usually one that I think most thinkers of animal ethics and animal rights don't follow him in. The second gesture is to ask, but are we really certain that the human has those characteristics fully that he has attributed to himself? So in the case of language, is it really the case that one can say that humans respond, humans speak, they have language, they respond, but the animal reacts like a machine? Is that really the case? Is it really the case that someone like Lacan should be able to argue that when a full notion of the unconscious suggests that much of our language is automatic, much of our language is not spontaneous and fully intended, but precisely machine-like, automatic in a certain way? So that then begins to, the second gesture, begins to destabilize not simply the human-animal distinction, but the very foundation for the human. And at that point, with the two gestures combined, we then move from, I think, an oppositional logic, a logic of a binary, the human on the one side and the animal on the other, the human who has language, mourning, technology, and the animal who does not, to a much more differential logic, whereby the human has language to a certain degree, and other animals perhaps have language to a degree that can be now put on a kind of perhaps a kind of not a hierarchy but a kind of scale, and this creates a very different way of looking at the animal. It precisely means that we can no longer look at the animal as opposed to the human, but we begin to see other alliances: the animals that dream, the animals that have language, the animals that mourn, and in different ways. So I think that's one of the ways in which Derrida's work, and from The Animal, Therefore I Am, to these two volumes of The Beast and the Sovereign, begin to rethink the human-animal distinction.
En ese sentido también, en este último seminario, hay una idea que va a estar cruzando y que va a estar problematizando Derrida, que es la idea de la relación con la muerte. Y en este sentido va a hablar un poco de Blanchot, va a hablar un poco de esta posibilidad si realmente guardamos o no una relación con los entes en cuanto entes, ¿no? Con las cosas en cuanto...
Pero como muerte. Well, he's asking right now. The question is about how, also in a great theme that you've talked about today a lot, the relationship with death, and not only with death, but with the dead. Not only death, but with the dead. So it would be very, very illuminating if you could, give a little bit more and tell us a bit more of how Derrida treats this, not only death, but the dead, and our relationship with death and the dead.
A very interesting and important question. And maybe the best place to start would be to begin where we left off just a moment ago, talking about the human in relationship to the animal. Because among the many attributes that philosophers have given to the human and taken away from the animal has oftentimes been death. And particularly Heidegger, in the 1929-30 seminar that is at the center of the second volume of The Beast and the Sovereign, he argues at one point in that seminar that only the human really dies, whereas the animal perishes. And that's because only the human has a certain relationship to language, but also to world. He makes the famous claim in that text, Heidegger does, that the stone is worldless, the animal is poor in world, and the human is world building or world constructing. And it's on the basis of that world construction and a certain relationship to logos that makes the human the only one that can die. It has its own most possibility being death. So, given what we said before, Derrida will try to, I think you mentioned Blanchot, to rethink the notion of death not in terms of possibility, but in terms of impossibility, the impossibility to die. The impossibility for not just animals, again, to die, but for the human to die. It's not one of our possibilities. It's something that we submit to. And it's something that we can't take into our possession as our own most possibility. So once again, this strategy is double. On the one hand, question, wait a minute, is it really the case that only humans have a sense of their own death? Aren't there other animals that do? Aren't there other animals that die as opposed to perish? And then second gesture, but wait a minute, maybe not even the human actually can die, strictly speaking. The human is given over to death. Now, it's that thinking that then allows Derrida to rethink, or at least to change the polarity and orientation of one's way of thinking about death. Instead of thinking about the subject's relationship to his or her own death in The Beast and the Sovereign, Derrida's thinking instead about what becomes of one when one's dead. In other words, instead of thinking of death as what is my own, he thinks of death in relationship to the hands into which I will be entrusted when I die. Who will be there to receive me, to tragen, exactly, that's right, to tragen, yes, to bear me. The tragen is to be, it's nice that you want to go in that direction. Tragen not just as that which bears me into this world, but that which bears me after I'm gone, the one who must deal with my remains. And so actually in the middle of The Beast and the Sovereign seminar, we find a definition of the other, which is quite surprising in relationship to other definitions. The other is not, as in, say, Levinas, for example, that which puts an infinite demand upon me, which for Derrida, the other is also in other contexts, but the other is the one into whose hands I will be entrusted at death. That's a very different orientation for posing the question of death and the dead, I think.
También en este sentido Derrida, al hacer una crítica a esta idea de la soberanía que no es compartida, que dice que la soberanía es de aquel que está solo, también nos va a estar invitando a pensar la soberanía de una manera distinta, ¿no?
Well, surely of course, because of the theme of seminars, the sovereignty is one of the main topics, and he's going to be discussing with Schmidt and with Agamben and with many others. And what would be Derrida's input into this discussion in a way that he tries to think sovereignty in different terms, how he deconstructs sovereignty, but what would be his main achievement or what he's trying to do,
Well, it's interesting because I would want to read together the second volume of The Beast and the Sovereign and a text such as Rogues, which is one that precedes it by just a couple of years. In Rogues, Derrida is trying to rethink the notion of sovereignty, and particularly in relationship to democracy, beginning with Plato's critique of democracy and Aristotle's critique, but more sympathetic views toward democracy.
And politics of friendship.
And the politics of friendship as well, that's right. All the way up to Schmidt, as you mentioned Schmidt. And that book has many figures, Rogues does, and it tries to propose a notion of sovereignty whereby the sovereign's unconditionality would be severed from his power. So a notion of sovereign unconditionality that would be powerless. And that seems to be about as far as we get in that volume. The Beast and the Sovereign then picks up these very same issues, but it does so with a slightly different emphasis, with the different texts. It goes back to the Heidegger 1929-30 text, but especially, I think, with a different tone. There's a very different tone. And I think maybe it was clear in what we've been talking about all day today, that it's my view that this text, The Beast and the Sovereign, is written not necessarily with the explicit knowledge, but in a certain sense with the knowledge that Derrida's own sovereignty, his own self-possession, is being undermined by the pancreatic cancer that would kill him 18 months later. You can't but read this text without feeling that shift in tone. So as we move towards the end of the second volume, Derrida begins interrogating even more this notion of Walten, Heideggerian Walten, as that which is hyper-sovereign, that which is beyond sovereignty. And it's not clear, absolutely clear to me, how to understand it. It's not clear to me whether it should be thought in terms of the hyper-sovereignty that he would characterize as the Platonic good. There are aspects of it that remind one of that. But of course the danger there is that good has been used for political purposes. Even in the Republic it's used for political purposes. It's the foundation of the Republic in many ways. Or whether he's thinking of a notion of sovereignty that's to be thought even beyond that kind of notion of the good which is paternal, which is giving, and so forth, in terms of another notion of sovereignty that I would hazard to call tragic, but I don't know if I want to. But it comes in, I call it tragic because it comes in via Heidegger's reading of Sophocles. And so the Beast and the Sovereign Volume 2 ends with this thinking of a notion of hyper-sovereignty named Walten, which is identified not just by Heidegger but by Derrida with a certain notion of physis, a certain notion of eruption or of growth, but also of destruction. And it's also identified with différance. And there we're moving towards a notion of destruction, of violence that can't be separated from creation and production. And there we've got a very different notion, it seems to me, than the notion of the good as epikeina tesousias that gives of itself without any of its power being diminished. I think we have a very different, more tragic notion, I think, of a kind of hyper-sovereignty, or beyond of sovereignty, in the name of this originary violence. So I think that's what I see happening in the course of this final seminar. One has to be wary of projection, of projecting, knowing that Derrida would die soon after this seminar, and wary of projecting this upon the text, but I've tried to, in my reading of it, I've tried to account for that possibility of projection. Whether I'm successful or not, I don't know. Anyway.
Bueno, voy a hacer la pregunta en español y ahora la hago en inglés otra vez. Yo me gustaría mucho, porque siento que es un seminario de filosofía política y porque aparte el doctor Naas le ha dado un giro hacia el rezo, ¿no? Que explicar un poco cómo se relacionaría esto, no solo como performatividad y performatividad política, en relación con la justicia, su noción de justicia como porvenir. So now I'm going to ask Dr. Nash, how would you understand, you've come here and you've talked about how performativity of the prayer, which is for you it's like the axis of the second seminar. How could you relate, or how could that help us understand? Because I believe there's a very, very intrinsic relationship with his notion of justice, of avenir, always to come, and how that not only relates in a death, mourning, and religion and faith with politics as well. How these notions come together, I believe, in his last seminar. If you would like to comment a bit about that.
Well, that's a whole really interesting constellation, an important one of both themes and questions. So I can't do justice precisely to it, but in the talk that I gave this morning, I tried to think together certain aspects of the second volume of The Beast and the Sovereign on prayer, which are exactly right. I related to mourning, to the testament, to the trace and the archive. I related those aspects of that Beast and the Sovereign text to a text that Derrida was writing right around the very same time, entitled, to pick up your word, Justices. Now it's a text devoted to J. Hillis Miller, Derrida playfully says he never knew what J stood for, and he likes to imagine that it stood for justice, Justice Hillis Miller. I don't think it does. I think it's another name there, but he likes to imagine that Hillis Miller, that his first name is Justice, and is a thinker of justice. And that then raises the question you rightly posed of the relationship between prayer and these themes that we've been speaking of, and justice. And that I think it would take a lot of work to try to bring those together. But one would have to start by underscoring the difference that Derrida draws in texts such as Force of Law and others between law and justice. The way in which law is always deconstructible, perfectible, and in the name of justice, in the name of a certain justice that always exceeds any given law. And I think you're exactly right to want to think of justice as futural, or as that which impels the very self-critique of law. It's justice, in a certain sense, that calls law to move, to iterate itself, and hopefully to improve itself. It's justice that accounts for the iteration and survival of the law. And one would have to then, and I'm not prepared to do that now, but would have to then think that in relationship to what I said earlier today about the notion of the archive, and about the archive as a place of prayer, a place not where prayers are stored and archived as if they were traces of the past, but a place where they open up onto the future. And at that point, prayer would have to be thought in relationship not just to that restricted group of speech acts that we call prayer, but why not certain formulations of law, certain formulations of human rights? Why not think of those as precisely notions of prayer that need to be repeated, that need to be perfected, and that in the name of a certain justice require review and self-critique. That was a little fast, and I would want to spend much more time trying to bring prayer together with justice, but I think the first place to look would be at the relationship between law and justice and try to get us to where we just ended.
I was thinking of it more how he starts his eulogy to Gadamer. Would I be able to do justice?
Mm-hmm.
Would I be able to give testimony
Yes.
of the dialogue? Or, that's a word I don't
Right.
use often.
Yeah.
More in that, in a way in which testimony would be justice regarding death, and in that way it could be prayer. So, I was thinking also that kind of, and also when he talks about shibboleth and
Yes.
selan and those kind of, arguments he tries to develop.
I think that's excellent. I think you'd have to bring in then the notion of testimony. And I think you're exactly right. And the Gadamer text that you mentioned would be a good place to begin. No, I think that's exactly
Give
right.
justice to the dead.
Yes.
Also, more Benjamin kind of
Yes.
link.
Yeah. I'm not sure that one would ever be able to say in the present, we have done justice to the dead, we just did justice to the dead, or we someday will do that. It's not clear that one could ever make that justice present with such a constative, precisely, but say that we've just done justice. But I think that's exactly the kind of relationship between justice and testimony that we're looking for here.
And prayer also.
And prayer, yeah.
Finalmente, me gustaría también rescatar quizá una última reflexión de Derrida. Dice, sí hay algo que comparte el animal con el Dasein humano. Hay un poder que compartimos que es una suerte de poder que es impotente, un poder impoder, si se puede decir de esa forma, en palabras de Derrida, que nos remite a la figura de Jeremy Bentham, ¿no? Y esto me interesa en el sentido de que, ¿cuál podríamos decir que es esta propuesta de ética de Derrida con respecto al viviente, ¿no? Con respecto a los seres vivos en general?
Well, it's another variation of the question of the ethics of the animal, regarding how the relationship of Dasein with animal and how it comes. Derrida tries to articulate it along the link of Bentham, and how that proposes an ethics of the living. So how could you help us a bit more to understand what Derrida is trying to do?
Well, that's good. That's a very good question, because it brings us back to the first couple of questions that are at the beginning of our discussion. Derrida sees and criticizes a long philosophical tradition that tries to locate certain powers and capacities in the human and deny them to the animal. So the human, as we've said, human has the capacity for language, technology, mourning, death, and so on. And that's the main philosophical line or lineage that Derrida finds in the West, from Plato and Aristotle all the way to Lacan and Levinas, whom he's somewhat critical of in The Beast and the Sovereign, as well as in The Animal That Therefore I Am. But if that's the main line, there are minority discourses throughout the tradition that have tried to see the animal in a different light or to do something different with the relationship between the human and the animal. And one of them would be Jeremy Bentham. So Jeremy Bentham, instead of asking the question, what can the human do, or what is the capacity for the human and what is the capacity for animals, he asks instead the question of passivity or of reception. He asks the question, can animals, it's still a can animals suffer? Do animals suffer? And that, Derrida claims, is a reorientation of all of our thinking about the human-animal relationship, no longer in terms of capacity, but in terms of receptivity, or this very strange capacity to suffer, which is not like a capacity like any others. It's something that comes from outside of us, and to which we are ultimately submitted, which we are subject rather than being the subject that controls a capacity. So Bentham's very important for Derrida in not just posing the question of animal suffering, which is very real and very important, but the question of the orientation in philosophical thinking from the subject to the other, from the subject to the subject's reception at the hands of the other. So I think that's maybe the best answer I can give to that question.
Thank you very much for your time. Muchas gracias también por haber ayudado a estar compartiendo aquí parte de la traducción. Y bueno, nuevamente, pues ya para un cierre, nos interesaría también saber qué es lo que está trabajando usted ahorita directamente, ¿no? ¿Qué trabajos vienen, ¿no?
Yeah, what are you working on right now, and what's your future projects regarding that or any other, by that matter?
Well, we've talked about some of them. So I've just finished a book on the volumes of The Beast and the Sovereign. So it's called The End of the World and Other Teachable Moments. Because Derrida, we didn't mention this today, but Derrida talks a lot about the end of the world in The Beast and the Sovereign.
Die Welt ist fort.
Die Welt ist fort, exactly. So this is a book that then is broken up by themes. One of them is the theme of prayer. One of them is the theme of the archive. One of them is the theme of the end of the world. And each section or chapter is devoted to one of these themes. And that's been done for quite a while, and it's coming out with Fordham University Press sometime this year. But the other project I've been working on is very related, but somewhat different for me. I'm writing on the work of Hélène Cixous in relationship to Derrida on questions of photography, telephony, and telepathy. Many of the things that we've been talking about today are related to those very themes. But that's the project that I've been working on for the last few months and will complete within the next few months. And then finally, I'll move back to one of my old loves, which is ancient philosophy, and begin working again on the question of Plato and the question of life, which is something that I've been working on over the last 3 or 4 years and would like to bring to a conclusion. Always with a slightly Derridian reading, but it's going to be a book devoted more or less to Plato. So let me thank you very much for
Thank you very much
this opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you.